Today really represents a program that we've put together to wrap up a pretty major research project that we had that started back in 2011. So at that time when we contacted the industry, the biggest issue was always these high feed costs. So we had a high Canadian dollar. Price of beef wasn't that great either. And really the industry was in pretty dire straits at that point in time. And when you ask them what kind of research should we do, and well, please do anything that could potentially lower feed costs, because that's always the biggest cost of production. And so we initiated a project at that time. It involved a number of players. It was sponsored by the Alberta Crop Industry Development Fund. But we were working with what at that time was Viterra, which is now High Pro Feeds here in Lethbridge. We're doing collaborative research with them. We had Feedlot Health Management Services up by High River involved in the project. They look after several feedlots. And then we had Agriculture Canada ourselves, and then we were also collaborating with the University of Saskatchewan in that project as well. So we have a team of scientists and graduate students who were looking at a variety of methods of really lowering feed costs. And one of the methods that we thought that we could use, that the emerging technologies, was related to NIR, or Near Infrared Spectroscopy, and its ability to predict feed value. And so obviously one way you can lower feed costs is to look at using byproduct feeds or formulating feeds that many of the industries see as basically a discard off of another main production stream. And part of the projects we're looking at basically using those ingredients, formulating them to mimic barley, but at a much fraction of the cost of what barley was worth at that time. And then also using NIR to predict the feed value, the energy value, the protein value of those feeds, and looking at the ability for that to really put a value on that and predict and try to hit the value that we were perceived that we do obtain with barley, but not at the price barley was at that time. Traditionally, NIR has been mainly used, as I mentioned, to predict the nutrient quality of the feed. And as you just did an interview with Larissa Jones, so it's a PhD student who's really trying to take it to the next level and actually predict the performance of the animal based on NIR spectra from the feces itself. So when we feed the animals, we know what we're feeding, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what they're getting if it's not being utilized by the and metabolized by the animal. If it ends up in the feces, then we paid for that feed, but the animal got no value from it. So really the ability then to measure the feed, measure the feces, and then predict the performance of the animal, because ultimately it's the performance of the animal that matters. That's what dictates profitability. And so that's where we were taking NIR to, and she was using starch content in the feces, and we got some very good prediction equations actually. And some producers would say, well, you don't need a fancy machine to see how much starch there is in the feces, and that might be true when you're looking at starch levels that are 30% in the feces or so. But when you're trying to differentiate between 5 and 12% starch in those feces, you really can't see that by just looking at it by eye. You need that kind of chemical analysis in order to make those kinds of measurements. And we're really hoping another aspect of that is that it will just make the producers more aware, because when they see a number and and we can compare, here's the amount of starch in your feces, here's the amount of starch in your neighbor's feces, they start to get a better appreciation for that difference and the potential impact that it could have on the profitability of their operations as well.
So how usable is this technology right now?
Well, I think from a feed perspective, it's very usable. So Daryl Gibb gave a presentation today looking at the byproduct feeds, predicting energy values. And basically the more variability there is in a feed product, the more NIR shines, because it can give you greater information about that variability and allow you to pay based on a sliding scale. So Daryl outlined how they actually had some feedlots had a deal with the organizations that were manufacturing these byproduct feeds, that they would pay based on the predictability of the NIR equation. So if the NIR equation said this was high quality stuff, they paid a bit more. But likewise, if they said it was low quality stuff, they paid a lot less. And so that's really good to be able to equate so that you make sure you're getting the value of your feed dollar that you're spending for the nutrients that you think you're buying. And that can be a problem in some of those byproduct feeds because of that variability. You can end up paying a lot more for the value of that than the actual feed value that's there.
Yeah. So how close do you think we are to widespread adoptability?
Well, we're going to have a discussion here at the end. What are the remaining challenges to adoption? I think some of it is related to the calibration curves, which we're working on within this. You may have heard some of the discussion. We need to have regional calibration curves because barley grown in eastern Canada is not the same as barley grown in western Canada. So we need regional specific calibration curves which are being developed. And then the other factor that we need to think about is the labor costs, right? Because it does take time to set that up. You need to have, and I know that labor is a big deal in the industry, and you've got a guy doing one thing. Well, if he's going to go do something else, he's got to stop what he's doing today, and there's got to be value recognized in him doing this other task. So we're hoping that the research that we've done will help it. Well, we believe it demonstrates some of that value that can be returned from the technology and make it worthwhile to invest those resources to gather that information.